From Silver to the Dollar, War, Capitalism, Marxism, and the Evolution of Global Economic Power. The history of modern politics can be viewed through many different lenses: nationalism, religion, military power, ideology, or the struggle for territory. But another lens is often just as revealing: the evolution of economic power and the monetary systems that support it. From the merchant banks of Renaissance Italy to the Spanish Silver Empire, the Dutch Commercial Revolution, British industrial capitalism, and the modern American dollar system, political power has repeatedly followed economic power. Wars have both reflected these transformations and accelerated them. The American Civil War is an important turning point in this story. By 1861, the United States was divided between two very different economic systems. The industrializing North possessed a much larger population, extensive railroad networks, manufacturing capacity, and increasingly sophisticated financial institutions. The South possessed enormous wealth, but much of it was concentrated in land and enslaved labor and depended heavily on cotton exports. The Confederacy believed that cotton gave it leverage over Europe. If Britain and France needed Southern cotton badly enough, Confederate leaders hoped European powers might intervene on the Southern side. But the strategy failed. The Union blockade restricted Confederate exports. European countries found alternative sources of cotton, and the North demonstrated that an industrial economy could sustain a prolonged modern war. The Union also developed a remarkably powerful financial system for financing the conflict. The federal government sold enormous quantities of government bonds, while the National Banking Acts helped create a more integrated national banking system. The government could therefore mobilize not only soldiers and factories but also the savings and credit of an entire population. The Civil War consequently represented more than a military victory. It strengthened the political and economic foundations of an industrial American nation. At almost exactly the same historical moment, another intellectual challenge to capitalism was developing in Europe. Karl Marx did not emerge after the Civil War. He had already published the Communist Manifesto with Friedrich Engels in 1848. Marx was attempting to understand the enormous social transformation produced by industrial capitalism, the growth of factories, wage labor, urbanization, concentrated ownership, and increasingly powerful industrial classes. Marx's criticism of capitalism was fundamentally about the relationship between ownership and labor. Capitalism, in his view, had enormous productive power, but the people who controlled productive capital possessed a fundamentally different economic position from those who survived primarily by selling their labor. The publication of the first volume of Capital in 1867 came only 2 years after the American Civil War ended. This coincidence is historically interesting because the United States was moving rapidly toward becoming one of the world's great industrial capitalist powers, while Marx was developing one of the most influential critiques of industrial capitalism. But Marxism should not be confused with every ideology that subsequently used the language of socialism. The Russian Revolution eventually produced a communist state based explicitly on Marxist theory, but the political movements that emerged in Europe during the 20th century followed very different paths. Fascism and National Socialism were hostile to Marxist internationalism and especially hostile to communist movements. Marxism emphasized class conflict and ultimately envisioned the abolition of capitalist class structures. Fascism instead attempted to subordinate class conflict to the nation and the state. The Nazi movement presents an especially important example because its official name contained the word socialist. National Socialism, however, was not simply Marxism with German nationalism added to it. Nazi ideology rejected Marxist class struggle and internationalism and instead centered on racial nationalism, authoritarian government, militarism, and territorial expansion. This distinction becomes critical when examining the economic conflicts of the 20th century. The world was not simply divided between capitalism and socialism. It became a battlefield between several competing visions of how society should be organized: liberal capitalism, communism, fascism, national socialism, and various forms of social democracy. Behind these ideological struggles was another transformation: the changing center of global financial power. Long before modern capitalism, banking families and financial institutions had played important roles in European politics. The Medici banking network became enormously influential during the Renaissance. Centuries later, the Rothschild family developed one of Europe's most important international banking networks. Governments needed bankers because wars were expensive. Bankers needed governments because governments issued debt. This created a powerful relationship between political authority and finance without necessarily requiring a secret conspiracy. Throughout history, governments have borrowed enormous sums to fight wars, build infrastructure and maintain empires. Financial institutions consequently became deeply connected to the rise and fall of political powers. This is where claims that powerful banking families deliberately financed both sides of wars deserve careful examination. There is historical evidence that major financial institutions operated across borders and sometimes dealt with governments on opposing sides of conflicts. But that is not the same thing as evidence that those institutions secretly created wars for the purpose of controlling the outcome. The distinction matters. The documented history is already remarkable enough. The center of global economic power had been moving for centuries. Spanish silver helped make the Spanish dollar one of the most important international currencies of the early modern world. Dutch commercial and financial power subsequently became extraordinarily influential. Britain then emerged as the dominant industrial and financial power of the 19th century. The British pound and the international gold standard became central to the 19th century global economy.
Then came the 20th century. 2 world wars devastated the European powers that had dominated the previous international system. The United States emerged from World War II with an enormous industrial economy, immense gold reserves, and an increasingly dominant financial position. In 1944, representatives of the Allied nations gathered at Bretton Woods and created a new international monetary architecture. The U.S. dollar became the central currency of the system, while the dollar itself was convertible into gold for foreign governments and central banks. The monetary center of gravity had effectively moved across the Atlantic. Then, in 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility into gold. The world entered the modern era of fiat currencies. The dollar's dominance nevertheless survived. One important reason was the enormous role of the United States in global trade and finance. Another was the importance of oil. During the 1970s, oil-producing countries accumulated enormous quantities of dollars from energy exports. Those dollars flowed through international banks and financial markets, creating what became known as the Petrodollar recycling system. This created a new form of monetary power. The United States no longer needed to promise that every dollar could be exchanged for gold. Instead, the dollar's strength increasingly rested upon the size and credibility of the American economy, the depth of its financial markets, the global role of U.S. institutions, and the continuing demand for dollar-denominated assets. This brings us to the present. The global monetary system may now be entering another transition. The dollar remains extraordinarily powerful, but the rise of China, the expansion of the euro, increasing interest in gold, alternative payment systems, and attempts by some countries to reduce their dependence on the dollar raise a larger historical question. Are we witnessing another shift in the center of global economic power? History provides no simple answer. Spanish silver did not remain permanently dominant. Dutch financial power eventually gave way to British supremacy. Britain's industrial and financial dominance eventually gave way to American dominance. Economic systems evolve. Currencies evolve. Empires evolve. Political ideologies evolve with them. Perhaps the most useful lesson is that these transformations rarely have a single cause. Wars are not simply banking operations. Capitalism is not simply a conspiracy. Marxism is not synonymous with every form of socialism, and fascism is not merely another variety of Marxism. But money, credit, ownership, industrial capacity, and financial institutions profoundly influence what governments are capable of doing. The deeper historical question, therefore, may not be who secretly controls the world. It may be something more measurable. How does control over capital, production, credit, and currency translate into political power, and what happens when that economic power begins to move from one civilization to another? Seen through that lens, the American Civil War becomes one chapter in a much larger story, the transition from the old European commercial empires toward an industrial world dominated first by Britain and eventually by the United States. And the next chapter may be unfolding now.
Marx, American Capitalism and the Making of the Post-War World. What happens when Marx's critique of capitalism develops alongside the rise of American industrial capitalism? 1776, America declares independence. Adam Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations. The foundations of modern capitalism are taking shape. 1818, Karl Marx is born into a Europe being transformed by industrialization. 1840s, Marx encounters industrial capitalism and Friedrich Engels. Their focus turns toward class, labor, ownership, and the machinery of capitalism. 1848, Marx and Engels publish the Communist Manifesto, arguing that capitalism is revolutionary, but also creates conflicts between capital and labor. 1861–65, the American Civil War demonstrates the enormous power of industrial production, railroads, finance, and mass mobilization. 1867, Marx publishes Capital, attempting to dissect how capitalism creates, concentrates, and reproduces wealth. 1870s–1900, American capitalism explodes. Railroads, steel, oil, corporations, banking, and eventually massive concentrations of wealth. 1929, the Great Depression creates a crisis of confidence in laissez-faire capitalism. 1930s, Roosevelt's New Deal reforms capitalism rather than abolishing it, regulation, labor protections, public programs, and a larger federal role. 1939–45, World War II transforms America into an industrial superpower. 1944–45, Bretton Woods, the IMF, World Bank, and post-war Reconstruction help establish a U.S.-centered international economic system. And here is the historical irony: Marx predicted capitalism would become increasingly global and concentrated. American capitalism ultimately became global, but instead of disappearing, it repeatedly reinvented itself. The post-war world combined private enterprise, government regulation, organized labor, mass consumption, international finance, and American economic power. The Cold War then turned economics into an ideological competition, capitalism versus communism. But underneath the politics were questions Marx had raised nearly a century earlier: who owns productive assets? Who controls capital? Who benefits from technological progress? And can capitalism continually adapt to its own contradictions? The 20th century became the great experiment. Marx criticized capitalism. America transformed it. And after World War II, both ideas became global forces.